Hi, welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this podcast, we're going to continue talking about the average cost, marginal cost, and total cost. And so, on a previous video, we laid out the marginal cost, the average total cost, average variable cost, average fixed cost. We used the averages to find the totals, and we're going to do that again on this video. And just keep in mind what's happening here when we do this. What's happening here when we do this is we are looking at a specific level of production, and at that specific level of production, we are finding, what the different numbers are, what the different costs are, the total cost, total variable cost, total fixed cost, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing that we want to do, and what we're going to start with on this video, is we're going to look at the general pattern that exists. We're going to look at the general pattern that exists on this graph. And so I have the general pattern up here, and let me just move this over a little bit. There we go. And so let's talk about this general pattern a little bit. So here are going to be five general patterns, five general conclusions that we can make about what these cost curves usually look like. So the first thing that we can say is average costs are going to tend to decrease, hit a minimum, and then rise. And that's not quite true the way I said that. I really should say this. When I say average cost here, I should say that average total cost and average variable cost, those two curves will always decrease, hit a minimum, and then rise. So here's the average total cost curve. It's going to, as we increase production, average total cost is going to decrease. It's going to hit a minimum right here, and then it's going to begin to rise. Okay, that's what average total cost is going to look like. And then average variable cost is going to be the same thing. It's going to, as you increase production, average variable cost is going to decline, hit a minimum, and then it's going to begin to rise. So that's the first conclusion. Second conclusion, or second pattern, is that the average fixed cost, I'm not sure if I'm quite saying this mathematically correct. I think I am. The average fixed cost is going to be asymptotic with respect to the horizontal axis. What I'm trying to say is that the average fixed cost, as we increase production, the average fixed cost is going to decline. And it's going to continue to decline and get smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's going to approach zero. It's going to approach the horizontal axis, which is zero. It's going to approach the horizontal axis, but never touch it. So that's the average fixed cost. It's going to decrease, but never quite get to zero. Okay, that's the average fixed cost. So it's going to be asymptotic with respect to the horizontal axis. It's going to decrease and get closer and closer and closer to zero, but never actually get to zero. Okay, number three, the average total cost and the average variable cost are asymptotic with respect to each other. That means they're going to get closer and closer and closer to each other, but never touch. So look at the distance between average total and average variable. So here at the beginning, far apart, the difference between the average total and the average variable, far apart. As we increase production, the average total and average variable are going to get closer and closer and closer to each other. They're going to get closer and closer and closer to each other, but they're asymptotic. So what that means is they're never actually going to touch each other. They will never actually intersect each other. They will get closer and closer and closer without ever touching. And why is that? That's because what is in between average total and average variable is your average fixed cost. This is your average fixed cost right here. All of these are your average fixed cost. So the average fixed cost is here, and the average fixed cost is here. It's here, and it's here. It's here, and it's here. So since the average fixed cost is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and since the distance between average total and average variable is your average fixed, then they're going to get closer and closer and closer and closer together, but never touch as the average fixed cost gets smaller and smaller and smaller. As it approaches zero, these two curves are going to approach each other. Okay, so that's our third pattern that we can notice on this graph. Okay, number four. Marginal cost is going to hit a minimum and then rise. The marginal cost curve will hit a minimum and then rise. So here's the marginal cost. It will always come down, hit a minimum, and then begin to rise. And then it'll begin to rise. And then number five, what goes along with that is that the average total and the average variable will be at their minimums when they are intersected by marginal cost. Okay, so what that means is that where the marginal cost curve, here's your marginal cost curve, when it intersects the average variable cost, which is right here, that's where the average variable cost is at its minimum. And then as the marginal cost continues going, it will hit the average total cost curve. That's going to be right there. It will hit the average total cost curve at the minimum of the average total cost. Okay, so the marginal cost will decrease, hit a minimum, and then rise, and it will intersect the averages, the average variable cost and average total cost at their minimum point. That will always be the case. Okay, so that's the general pattern. That's what the general pattern looks like. So we have now looked at the very specific, when we choose one level of production, how to look at the cost curves, and then we've looked at the general patterns of the entire cost curves. All right, and so what we're going to do on a future video is we're going to look at this again. We're going to go back again to looking at specific levels of production. So again, two ways to think about the cost curves. First way is to think about a specific level of production and graphing all of your total boxes, and then the other way to think about it is to think about the entire graph. Think about patterns on the entire graph. All right, this has been Mr. Hagan on another Econ podcast. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.